Hello and welcome to session number 12 for English section 3004, composition 2. It's Tuesday and it's me, Mr. Fowler, in my same inimitable style to deliver new and fresh content to you, students of section 3004. I'm so happy that you're joining me this week for our discussion. We're getting back into The Princess Bride. Specifically, we're covering the material today over chapters 3 and 4. And consequently, I have a new PowerPoint for you. There's a new discussion question for this week, and there's a reminder about our ad analysis essay final draft. So without further ado, let's get into it. I, of course, as always, am going to do a share screen here. And I'll go ahead and share our PowerPoint session for today. Now, I'm over here as per usual on the upper right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to disappear in just a few minutes, but you should still hear the sound of my voice as I narrate these slides. So because I know that it's a little bit difficult to make the feed process with the video and the lecture points, I'm going to just mute my visual. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop my video. And then I'm going to share my screen with you once again. You should still be able to hear my voice. Okay, and we're going to go slideshow from the beginning. Okay. So for today, session 12, let's break down our preview of what's to come. First of all, we're going to take a look at and review content from The Princess Bride, chapters 1 and 2. Then I'm going to lecture today about Princess Norina and the prospect of peace in chapters 3 and 4. Then we're going to zoom over and take a look at our weekly discussion questions, and I'm going to try to leave some time in today's allotted section of the course to begin working on those questions if you feel the need to do so. Now, for next time on Thursday's session, don't forget, just as a reminder, that drafts, final drafts now of the ad analysis are due this Friday, October 2nd, sometime before midnight if possible. But certainly not at any point beyond that. Now, a couple of students have reached out to me, and they've asked about the final draft of the ad analysis. This is kind of tricky, because if you've had me in the past, you will know that I've said, unless you really had nothing to change, I would let you decide whether or not you wanted to revise. If you didn't want to revise and wanted to stand on your existing score, you had that option. This semester is a little bit different though, because the ad analysis is a departmental-wide requirement for composition 2. I'm going to have to insist that you do create a final draft of your ad analysis. Now, that might not be very much work for you, especially if many of you got a really high percentage, like in the upper 90s. But there's still a few bells and whistles to check off of your list of revision work. So I will ask you to do that. I'm trying to recollect as to whether or not I gave anybody a full perfect score. I don't think I did. But if I did give you a perfect score, you don't have to work very hard at all. Just change the due date of the final copy and go ahead and submit it anyway, so that if anybody in my department comes around and says, well, you know, Mr. Fowler, we heard rumors that you didn't have everybody revise the first project. I want to adhere to that and make sure I'm doing my due diligence as part of the department. So go ahead, even if you did get a perfect score on your draft, make sure that the due date reflects the current due date, and go ahead and upload it in the Dropbox, resubmit it so that everything looks in place. And then I'll just go ahead and revise it or take it through the process of revision a second time, in case I miss something the first time. Let's say that's what it is. Okay, so going back to the top of the order here for session 12 for Tuesday, September 29th. Let's review a little bit. So in The Princess Bride, chapters 1 and 2, we're introduced to the process of character development as a sort of trope or riff on the traditional romance adventure story. And one of the things that is part and parcel of this entire process is the little introductory chapter, where we learn about the transition of Billy Goldman from a young boy living in Chicago to the adult author William Goldman, and the interesting ways that his life intersects with the novel The Princess Bride. So this frame device kind of helps us to establish what exactly the meaning of this book is. And I would suggest, as I have in previous sessions, that the framework of the book, both the introductory chapter and the conclusion, are really the story. That's the actual story itself. The novel is just a way to facilitate the meaning of the story and to have some great fun while toying around with the conventions of the high romantic style of literature. Now, we're told, of course, that the original author of the book is a Florinese writer named S. Morgenstern, and that his book has been around for quite some time. None of this is true. Okay, there is no S. Morgenstern. And moreover, we discussed last time that William Goldman created this story not for his son. The Good Parts version doesn't exist for his son because there is no son. Actually, he has 2 daughters for whom he wrote this book because he felt a certain degree of guilt in missing out on significant portions of their childhoods as he traveled back and forth from New York to LA when he was working consistently in the screenwriting business. So one girl requested a story about brides, the other about princesses, so he consolidated the 2 ideas into one text. Chapter 1 then moves into the main narrative, where we're introduced to Buttercup by reputation only. Before we meet her as a person, as a character, we're told that she's one of the most beautiful women in the world, if not the most beautiful woman in the world during her lifetime. Leading up to this, though, we're introduced to a couple of, I guess you could call them prototype Buttercup-type characters. Annette, the scullery maid in the kitchen of the Duke of de Guiche, and his wife, who takes, takes certain degree of pleasure from ruining Annette's beautiful physique because she's quite a candy-holic, so to speak. She loves to snack on all sorts of treats. But all that really occurs as a result of this is that the Duchess gives herself a certain amount of ulcers and over the worry that this causes. Because the Duke had a wandering eye. It's not Annette's fault that the Duke is, just a kind of a salacious person. But he does lose interest once she, expands, so to speak, by eating these sweet treats. But then she finds really wonderful love and a solid relationship with the baker employed by the Duke. So even she doesn't really go down to ruin as such. The other person that we find out was a very beautiful or sort of prototype character is Adela. And Adela is notable in as much as she is aware that she's very beautiful, but she's got some problems. This constant maintenance that's required to keep herself, beautiful and charming, makes her extremely neurotic. And she doesn't believe that anybody could truly love her if she doesn't have the physical attributes required to maintain her status. And so what we get on the one hand with Annette is someone who is very beautiful in terms of her personality and in terms of the kind of way that she views the world. She was extremely attractive. She lost some, I should say, of the physical attributes that made her so beautiful, but her personality doesn't change. She's a little bit like Fiona from Shrek, right? She might have been physically beautiful on the outside before she met Shrek, but after she meets Shrek, we realize that the part of her that makes her beautiful is really on the inside. And she finds a match in Shrek, even though it's not what she originally thought of for her, beloved person, her beloved match. And with Adele, we get the other sort of perspective. We get someone who is, again, very physically beautiful, but who's kind of rendered miserable because she worries about how to maintain that physical beauty. So much to the point that she actually begins to wrinkle her face with worry lines. And the neuroses eventually erodes her personality so that because she can't believe her husband would ever truly love her if she doesn't stay beautiful, she gives him merry hell for the remainder of their wedding. But then we quickly move on to Buttercup. And Buttercup, of course, because she's the titular character of this book, embodies the best of both worlds. Yes, she's a little bit spoiled at the beginning, but once she kind of comes into the full bloom of her youth and beauty, she realizes that she has a truer, deeper love for Wesley. And moreover, she does seem to be relatively lucky in that while she's naturally beautiful, she doesn't really do too much to maintain that. She doesn't fuss over herself. And it's only her love and concern for Wesley that inspires her to begin to take her looks into account. This is all touched off, of course, by a visit from Count Rugen and his wife, the Countess. And the Countess pays special attention to Wesley, which inspires Buttercup to sort of step up her game. Now, eventually what happens is that Wesley sort of rejects her interest, which completely frustrates her, only to return to her room to explain that he's going abroad to America. Because as William Goldman, our author, states, this was after the discovery of America and this magical, all-consuming time that just fits perfectly for his characters. And of course it can do that because it doesn't have to be hemmed in by the laws of logic and reason. That's not the kind of story that's being told. Now, Wesley, unfortunately, in his travels to the colonies in the United States, runs afoul of the dread pirate Roberts. And we're informed that Buttercup is miserable due to his assumed murder. After all, the dread pirate Roberts, as we know even from the film, does not take prisoners. Now, that leads us to Chapter 2, The Groom. And Chapter 2 is dedicated primarily to a description of Prince Humperdinck. It's exactly 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long. And we learn certain things about Prince Humperdinck. Specifically, he's a barrel-chested man who is a master hunter. He does have a tendency to walk like a crab. but his great passion in life is hunting. And as such, he designs a zoo, a multi-layered zoo, where each level is filled with all sorts of exotic beasts that he uses to challenge himself, except for, of course, the 5th level, which is empty. And it's this 5th level that will later house Count Rugen's infamous machine, the Pit of Despair, as it's referred to in the film adaptation. All right, that gets us pretty much up to speed for today's session. So let's go ahead and begin our discussion of today's material, chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 of The Princess Bride is subtitled The Courtship. And most importantly, none of this content is in the movie. I'll state that again. Everything that happens in chapter 3 and everything really that happens in chapter 4, except for one line in the entire writing, is totally excised from the movie. So this is a good chapter for us to talk about. Most of the time spent in chapter 3 and 4 is a transitional scheme from comedy and commentary. So we move from high comedy to kind of serious commentary. Primarily, it introduces Humperdinck's family and gives us some answers. Why is it that he chooses to marry Buttercup? And of course, we get the first mention of Miracle Max, who is a major character in the later chapters. But most of chapter 3 focuses on a character that doesn't appear in the film adaptation at all, but who does serve a fairly important function in the novel, which is Princess Nerina. Princess Nerina is critical because she offers a chance for peace in this medieval world of Florin and Gilder. Remember that Florin and Gilder are warring countries who respectively refer to the channel of water that flows between them as either the Gilder Straits or the Straits of Florin. If you're from Florin, understandably enough, it's the Strait of Florin. If you're from Gilder, it's the Strait of Gilder. So it depends on where you're at. Now, let's quickly run down Prince Humperdinck's council. Count Rugen, who's already been introduced in chapter 1 and continues to make appearances in chapter 2 and 3, is sort of his right-hand man. And as we will learn, he has a very distinct and dark past, all his own. But for right now, he's simply Humperdinck's right-hand man. Now, interestingly, even though Prince Humperdinck seems to be in charge of Florin, he's actually waiting for his father, King Lotharin, to die. So King Lotharin is still technically the king, despite Humperdinck having moved into a position of power. Queen Bella is another character that is featured in the film adaptation, but isn't nearly as deep as she is in this iteration. We're told specifically that he calls Queen Bella E.S., which is a nickname he's assigned to her because she is, after all, his stepmother. And we're told that Humperdinck's logic is such that since he only has ever heard of evil stepmothers, he assumes Queen Bella must be evil. We really don't know that's true per se, but I think it's interesting that we have another sort of fairy tale trope that's introduced. And I ask a question of you here. Is Queen Bella truly evil? Is there some sort of suggestion that evil stepmothers somehow produce evil children? I think back to the evil stepmother in Cinderella. And again, some accounts, she was the nurse for Cinderella's father after his wife had died. And they develop a relationship. And there's even some suggestion that she may have acted to kill him in order to get an advance on his property and his fortune. And then she brings her children into the family, and they're interestingly referred to as evil stepsisters. But we don't get that impression necessarily from Queen Bella. We know that she's sort of shaped like a gumdrop, which I think is about as unflattering of a description as you could come up with. But again, I guess sort of that description is appropriate in so much as, now give me a moment here, in so much as it does describe the general shape of dress of ladies' dress in the medieval period, right? They have these big hoop skirts or whalebone skirts that sort of have a gumdrop type of look. But he also said she was colored like one. She was a raspberry. So the entire time I'm imagining this woman, I'm imagining like an anthropomorphized raspberry gumdrop, if such a thing even exists. I've had lots of gumdrops before. None of them tasted particularly like raspberry. Anyway, these three geniuses make up the council of Prince Humperdinck. And of course, Bella also has a specific ability in that she seems to be the only one who can correctly interpret King Lotharian's mumblings. Something has happened to King Lotharin. Now, if we look at his, I don't know, what's the word? I wish my nursing students were on here with me live. But if you look at his, what's the word? I can't come up with it now. But if you look at the condition in which he's in, there's a certain suggestion that he may have had something akin to a stroke that he has recovered from. He mumbles a lot, and it's unintelligible or unclear to most people. But Queen Bella can interpret what it is that he says. This would put her in a fairly advantageous position because she could simply misinterpret the platitudes that Lotharin pays to his son when he says, you know, any woman that were to get Prince Humperdinck as a husband would be pleased with him. But rather than create any kind of tension between the king and his son or make any sort of power grab, she doesn't do that. She stays on the up and up and actually makes sure that Humperdinck understands the compliment. And to his credit, even though he's the villain of the piece, he actually credits his father too. The exchange goes something like this. King Lotharian said, "I've been thinking it's really getting time for Humperdinck to pick a bride." He didn't actually so much as say it as mumble it, though. And Queen Bella was the only one who bothered ferreting out his meanings anymore. "You couldn't be righter, dear," she said, and she patted his royal robes. "What did he say?" "He said whoever we decided on would be getting a thunderously handsome prince for a lifetime companion." And then Humperdinck again says, "Tell him he's looking quite well himself," the prince returned. To which Queen Bella explains, "We've only just changed in Miracle Men. That accounts for the improvement." And then Humperdinck seems surprised to hear that, "You mean you fired Miracle Max? I thought he was the only miracle man left." "No," Queen Bella explains, "we found another one up in the mountain, and he's quite extraordinary. Old, of course, but then who wants a young miracle man?" "Tell him I've changed Miracle Men," King Lotharian said. But it came out, "Tell Mumbo Mumbo." What did he say, the prince wondered. And of course, Queen Bella clears this up and says, "He said that a man of your importance could marry just any princess." So she's got at least one intention that runs counter to Humperdinck's ideology. Humperdinck is a hunter. He's a man of action, and he has intentions of destroying or conquering neighboring Gilder, as we later hear him admit in no uncertain terms. But her main purpose is not to go to war with Gilder, but rather to perhaps develop a peaceful settlement with Gilder by marrying Prince Humperdinck to Princess Nerina. Now, this kind of peace is pretty typical of a lot of medieval marriages. Whether it was a family alliance or a national alliance, most royal marriages weren't based in or around love matches. Most of them were made in an effort to consolidate power or ensure peace, or at least ensure the prospect of peace for a generation or two, perhaps even a lifetime if the courtship was successful. As we know from even a cursory glance at history, though, often these kinds of pre-designed or set up marriages and courtships often didn't have the sort of effect that the intended parties desired. And most of the time, it was the prince or king in question who would break the marriage contract. The most notorious of these kinds of kings who operated in the style was Henry VIII, who had multiple wives and never really produced a male heir who lived. He did actually have one male heir whom he named Arthur, strategically enough. But unfortunately, young Arthur died in his early childhood. So it was Queen Elizabeth who came to power in the wake of her father's passing. But I digress. We're getting way far afield from, we're getting very far afield, I should say, from our text. So we're told that both countries had actually stayed alive by essentially warring against one another and finally teaming up in the Discord of the Emeralds to rob anybody who would sail within 100 feet of either of the countries. Some of the conflicts have extremely interesting titles, like the Olive War and the Tuna Fish Discrepancy and the Roman Rift, which are all played for high humor, I think. Now, Nerina, sorry for the relatively jarring image here, but Nerina is, again, someone who is attributed with great physical beauty. We see this plot thread multiple times as it's referred to with women. And chapter 3 is no exception. We get, first of all, the relatively disrespectful description of Queen Bella. Again, she sort of looks and is shaped like a raspberry gumdrop. Nerina is described by Queen Bella as physically quite attractive. She's also described as more of a knitter than a doer, which I think was such an interesting way to describe her personality. She has marble-ish skin, which is, I don't quite know what that means unless they're referring to the fact that marble is typically smooth. So maybe she has blemish-free, smooth skin. Marble itself, is in terms of its texture, is kind of a hodgepodge. So I don't think that's what they were going after there. I found that to be a perplexing way to describe someone. But a rose-ish complexion. Interestingly, though, one eye is green and one eye is blue. So we start to see that, perhaps she has some unconventional beauty. She's got an hourglass figure, but as Queen Bella emphasizes, she has a great wardrobe. She's sort of very haute couture, you know. She has high culture in terms of her haute couture, her wardrobe. And specifically, she has the largest hat collection in the world at the time. Of course, all Prince Humperdinck is interested in is whether or not she could be a hunter. Does she hunt? Queen Bella explains that, well, she's certainly muscular enough, not too muscular, but again, more of a knitter than perhaps a doer. So here, now I call this the first major edit. Obviously, chapter 2 would be the first major edit, but the first major edit of chapter 3 and chapter 4 pops in around this time. 3.5 pages into chapter 3, he explains that in the original text, Morgenstern spends several chapters, or pages rather, describing Queen Bella's packing. I think he says at one point it's like 11 pages of her packing. Another 3 are spent describing her journey to neighboring Gilder and then unpacking the material that we had just read about a scanned page and a half earlier. The two women meet, and Queen Bella extends an invitation to Princess Nerina, and Nerina accepts the invitation, and he says this takes about 1 page each. And then Nerina goes through the same process. She packs her wardrobe, and then she travels back to Florin. So he says the whole process takes about 72 pages. So my question here, why would all of this nonsense even be included? Is Goldman suggesting something about a genre here? And I believe that this is the case. Particularly, I think he must be taking a stab at the Canterbury Tales. If you've ever read the Canterbury Tales, they're a long series of medieval stories about pilgrims or travelers who are going or moving throughout Europe, traveling to the Holy Land in order to pay their respects or see some particular relics, or just visit this island, or not island, visit this area. Now, along the way, a lot of time and attention, a lot of detail is paid to each and every one of the pilgrims in the group. I think it's like 26 people or something like that. And each of the characters has a relatively lengthy description. And at one point, after the description of the pilgrims has been set up and established as the prologue, the actual Canterbury Tales themselves begin in earnest. Now, originally, Geoffrey Chaucer, who was the author of the Canterbury Tales and plays a critical component in A Knight's Tale, if you've ever seen that film. He's Vision, by the way, in that movie, played by Paul Bettany. But the real life version of the author is, or had, I think, intended to create all 26 stories, because he proposes in the introduction that in order to pass time as the pilgrims stop and rest, a story competition is announced. So every person has to come up with a story to tell on the way from the starting place in England to the Holy Land. And there's some speculation that he intended to create all 26 stories, but he never did. So either Chaucer didn't finish them, or he just introduced the idea of the contest and then wrote what he considered to be the most interesting of the stories. Of course, these include the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, the Tale of the Wife of Bath, and a few other stories in that collection. I don't even think there are 13. which would be half. I think there's something like 8. But Mr. Fowler only took one class in medieval literature, and I'm not an expert. So there may be instructors that you could reach out to who have interest in medieval literature. If that's the case, find out if you're interested in the Canterbury Tales and figure out what else could be gleaned from this. That's my theory in terms of why he would bother to give a note about Morgenstern and the actual description with all that stuff. But that's not important to our author, William Goldman, and as such, he cuts all of that out, just as his father had cut all of that out in his telling of the Good Parts version. Now, when we get back into the story, we're told about this great evening feast to honor the visit of Princess Nerina, which comes down amidst all of the pageantry and pomp and circumstance surrounding the meal itself to a single minute in time, a crucial minute, when we move from the precipice of peace into what is most likely going to be war. I found this really weird image of Prince Humperdinck, which has clearly been edited from the film in sort of like a Shrek type of style. Maybe that's why I had Shrek on the mind when I was referring back and forth to Buttercup's personality earlier. But I think it's really interesting in terms of the writing, how Goldman slows time down. He uses 3 pages to describe the transition between 8:23 and 8:24 in the evening. We witness critical events here, which culminate in the fact that Princess Norina is bald, and there's a gust of wind that sweeps through the exterior corridor where the feast is being held. But we're told that even though it's kind of a breezy evening, Prince Humperdinck prefers this setting. And if you disagree with Prince Humperdinck, you ran a very real risk of ending up in his dungeon. So no one complains, and consequently a gust of wind sails through and blows Princess Nerina's hat away from her head. And she's bald. Humperdinck absolutely loses this and declares that any potential courtship is most certainly off. This is why Buttercup becomes such a critical part of the story. Now, we know that Count Rugen was one of the many men who had come from miles and miles around just to catch a glimpse of Buttercup, and he keeps her in mind for just such an occasion. After being so disgruntled by the fact that Princess Nerina is bald, he explains that if you had a bald wife, people may say things behind your back about you, and Prince Humperdinck was not the kind of man to endure that sort of thing. Count Rugen has the easy answer. He says, if you're looking for someone who just looks nice, would it matter if she was a commoner? And, in light of what's just happened, Prince Humperdinck says, the commoner, the better. And then, of course, Count Rugen, knowing his best friend well, asks, what about if she was not a hunter? Would that matter? And he says, at this point, I'm so disparaged that I just want someone who is so beautiful that when you see her, you say, wow, that Humperdinck must be some kind of fellow to have a wife like that. And Count Rugen says, I know just the person. So in the latter half of the chapter, we get this very quick courtship, okay? Essentially, they travel to Buttercup's farm, and they wait for about a day, and Prince Humperdinck is kind of exhausted at this point and thinks he wants to turn back before he's even seen Buttercup. But that's when she finally appears outside her farmhouse, and he's like, ah, this is going to be perfect. And so he goes to her and intends that this is going to be a good match. And he comes to her and says, I must court her now. Leave us alone for a minute. And he rode one of his famous white horses down the hill to meet this milkmaid, Buttercup. And she said, and the author, Goldman, explains that she'd never seen such a giant beast of a horse or such a rider. I'm your prince, and you will marry me, he announces. Buttercup whispered back, I'm your servant, and I refuse. And, of course, the response to this is, as you would expect, I think, at this point. He says, I am your prince, and you cannot refuse. And Buttercup says, well, I'm your loyal servant, and I just did. And then he says, refusal means death. And she says, well, then you better kill me. And so then he's puzzled by this response, so he tries another tactic. I'm your prince, and I'm not that bad, so how could you rather be dead than married to me? And we get Buttercup's response. This is the issue on which she's hung up. Marriage involves love, she says, and that's a pastime which I did not excel. I had tried to love once, and it went badly, and I am sworn never to love another. So her love for Wesley is so profound that she realizes that she would never really be in love with anybody else. And the great thing about this is that rather than the prince exerting his influence, which he does do, I think it's interesting that both of them break down into a series of pragmatic considerations at this point. And Prince Humperdinck says, as you can see here, love? Who mentioned love? Not me. Look, there must always be a male heir to the throne of Florin. That's me. Once my father dies, there won't be an heir, just a king. Me again. When that happens, I'll have to marry and have children until there's a son. So you can either marry me and be the richest and most powerful woman in 1,000 miles and give turkeys away at Christmas and provide me a son, or you can die in terrible pain in the very near future. Make up your mind. And Buttercup considers this, and she says, well, I'll still never love you. And he said, I wouldn't want it if I had it. I wouldn't want true love if I had it. And then she says, well, if that's your take on it, then by all means, let us marry. So this is a really interesting moment because, again, it harkens back to something akin to the reality of most royal marriages and most prearranged marriages. Love is a secondary consideration. The first and primary consideration is the ability to produce a male heir to inherit the money and the status of the parents. And the fact that both of these characters are, within the context of a fairy tale story, more than willing to put that all aside in order to facilitate the marriage is a kind of a pragmatic approach in the midst of this high fantasy adventure. So again, we have high fantasy mixed together with a pragmatic approach to love and relationships. And that's heavily influenced by the time and context in which the story appears, which is the 20th century, the late 20th century, 1973. So again, is this William Goldman making a commentary about the nature of relationships and how they can exist and perhaps even thrive in certain circumstances without the presence of idealized or romantic love? Or is it just high humor to fuel the sort of ridiculousness that he uses to infuse the novel with a sense of comedy? That's something that's a bit of a debatable question. And specifically, it's a debatable question that you may want to consider. This might be a great potential paper topic for the purposes of later in the semester. All right, just a bit, another short chapter following chapter 3, which is the preparations for the wedding. So this is, again, maybe the third major edit that takes place. 72 pages, and an interesting cut it is. Of course, we know it's not truly a cut. This is the way he designed it from the beginning. But it's all spent describing some of the planning that goes into the wedding itself, the details. And you think in a book called The Princess Bride, the details regarding the wedding plans and everything like that would be relatively important. I once read a book called Delta Wedding. Oof, my heart goes out to you if you're ever assigned to read Delta Wedding. It's I think it's by Eudora Welty. I'm not 100% certain on that. But it is very lush writing in terms of the description. But the whole book hinges on this kind of one joke, which is that after chapters, I'm talking 100+ pages here, just describing the wedding itself and the planning and the angst surrounding the process, the actual wedding of the book, Delta Wedding, is described in, I don't even think it's a full page. I think it's a half a page or 2 paragraphs describing the ceremony and the wedding itself. And then there's like another couple of 100 pages describing the aftermath of the wedding, and all the preparations that had to go into that part. And I always thought that this book, The Princess Bride, was like the antithesis of the novel Delta Wedding, because that Delta Wedding is a book about all of the buildup that happens regarding the wedding and all the preparation, and then a very small bit about the action of the wedding itself, and then a lot of afterward. Whereas The Princess Bride is a very quick ramp up to what happens and almost no to very little consideration about the details. And then we're on to the action before a very quick conclusion wraps up. So I've always found those two texts to be kind of interesting counter variances against one another. So there are a few essential details that are not included in the film adaptation that I think answer some important questions here. Buttercup, number 1, is a commoner, as has been explained throughout the first 4 chapters. So consequently, she cannot marry the prince. What happens is they do an end run around this requirement by making Buttercup the princess of a small parcel of land called Hammersmith, which was an added bit of land that Humperdinck's father, King Lotharin, had conquered or inherited at some point or another, that didn't have a presiding royal person watching over it. And so she's assigned this duty and so forth and so on, and becomes the Princess of Hammersmith, and she's now eligible to marry Prince Humperdinck. The other important detail is that King Lotharin continues to improve in terms of his health. And Morgenstern, we're told, hated doctors and preferred miracle men. He also hated aristocracy as well, but it's important for someone who is going to marry into the aristocracy to understand how to behave in polite society. So he also explains that there's a lot of time spent on Buttercup's training in the ways of the aristocracy. So a couple things are important here. It's necessary, number one, that King Lothlorien is allowed to convalesce a little bit. If you've already seen the film adaptation, you know why. But if you're reading along in the text, it's important for the next several chapters that King Lothlorien not be set up to die before the end of the next couple of chapters. He has some important functions that he must fulfill. Beyond this, I think that since we know there's no real Morgenstern operating behind the wings, so to speak, that it's actually William Goldman's disdain for doctors versus the sort of imagined and wonderful miracle men who can actually perform miracles that we're reading into the text here. But the last part about Buttercup training to be part of the aristocracy is relatively important. Because again, to return to the context in which this story is written, this is a moment where Goldman takes into consideration the logos or the logic of his audience. In 1973, the majority of the people who are going to read The Princess Bride probably had very little to no knowledge about what a medieval aristocracy would have been like, or what kind of formal manners or training would have been necessary to navigate such a society. We had long ago abandoned all those kinds of high-minded conventions. And while there's a kind of upper class in the United States, it's nothing approaching the sort of aristocracy and the sort of court of manners that would have accompanied a medieval existence, or even an existence in the romantic genre of writing. Again, most of the time writers can get very carried away with the details of such things. So this is where the satirization comes in, or the satire of the entire process becomes apparent. If it's not critical or important to the contemporary reader's sensibility, as Goldman's probably correctly assumes it is not, better to just cut it out and explain that it happened in shorthand, as he does in this brief chapter 4. But as he notes, the most important thing about this portion of the text is that his father, meaning Goldman's father, reiterated that 3 years pass before we pick up chapter 5. So 3 years have passed. Why cut all this? Well, he didn't really cut it, obviously. And again, I think it's all about his desire as an author to present us with, as readers, to present us with a challenge. Are we able to absorb the kind of detail that would be necessary for us to read through a story like this? Or are we increasingly becoming spoiled audience members, spoiled readers, spoiled audiences, and spoiled fans, I suppose, of the media that we ingest? Our life becomes more busy as time goes on, or rather, I should say, in accordance to proper grammar, our lives get busier, and sometimes it's easier to just read the Wikipedia synopsis for a movie that we want to see, or a television episode, than sit down and actually take the 2 hours or hour and a half to watch the movie, or the 30 minutes required to watch the episode. Sometimes episodes of TV series are now even an hour in length due to the advent of these new streaming services. But again, in our fast-paced, hyper-fueled society, I think there's a tendency for some of us to want the most expedient version of whatever experience it is that we're chasing. So that's my theory. And And of course, we've only gotten worse, I think, in terms of our ability to wait and savor a story or a film since this novel was published in the late 70s, or mid 70s rather. However, I'm not so convinced of my own logic that I would object to the idea that something else is afoot here. Perhaps there is a parody going on, or some type of humor that I'm not quite cueing into that you have picked up on. And if so, this is another opportunity to pay attention to, because it may serve as the basis for a great potential paper topic later this semester. Okay. So that's pretty much all I have for today. And as such, that leaves us with just a question to consider for today's discussion, or this week's discussion. And for our weekly discussion, I have prepared a question for you. Let's see here. I'm looking at a file so I can make sure that I have the right question prepped. Here it is. So I'm going to ask you a discussion question. The first one for The Princess Bride is going to ask you to consider that this is a fantasy novel, right? And as we've said, that throughout the book, Goldman punctuates his text with certain parenthetical asides and refers to Morgenstern himself as a satirist. And even the unabridged version of the original Princess Bride as a satire. So Webster's dictionary defines satire as a usually topical literary composition, holding up human or individual vices, folly, abuses, or shortcomings to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, or other methods, sometimes with an intent to bring about improvement. So going by this definition, is the Good Parts version of The Princess Bride a satire? Why do you think that is? Is the good version's part a satire? And if it's not, then what kind of a book is The Princess Bride? So that's the question for you to debate in our weekly discussion topics. Is The Princess Bride merely a deep and detailed satire of the genre of romantic fiction, of fantasy fiction? Does it purposely bring out these contemporary thoughts, beliefs, and ideologies just so our author, William Goldman, can argue against the folly of pursuing a life of high adventure and great romanticism? Are these things that simply no longer exist for us? Or is he trying to get at something else? I welcome your thoughts and comments this week as we begin that process. Okay, for today though, I've come to the place where I'm finished. One last announcement. Don't forget that your final draft of the ad analysis project is due by the end of the day on Friday. That'll be October 2nd. I know time keeps slipping into the future here, but we've got to put that final project to rest so that we can start our next project next week. At least start the pre-writing process. So don't panic too much. Okay, that's all for Mr. Fowler today. I'm going to sign off. I will talk to you some more on Thursday, and I bid you a great rest of your week. Take care.